And then finally, just over about a month and a half ago, the journalist Ari Shavit, writing from Haaretz, interviewed Avram Borg. Avram Borg, former very high-ranking member of Knesset from the Labor Party, former Speaker of the Knesset, and then finally Chairman of the Jewish Agency, President of the Jewish Agency. Much of the interview was taken up with Ari Shavit's assailing the fact that Avram Borg still has a driver from his position at the Jewish Agency 10 years later and refuses to give up that driver. And most Israelis were sort of riveted on the sort of the corrupt aspect of Ari Shavit. But what Avram Borg had to say in this interview was exceedingly interesting, and I'm going to read you just select quotes from this. Ari Shavit asks him, "The truth is that you are a salient Europist," and Avram Borg has since moved to Paris. "You live in the top, but you are all Brussels, the prophet of Brussels." And Avram Borg replies, completely. I see the European Union as a biblical utopia. I don't know how it will hold together, but it is amazing. It is completely Jewish."
Yeah.
Okay. Go on. Then he goes on, and Ari Shavit says, "But you're saying here that you are suffering here for lack of spirit." Avram Borg responds, "Totally, we are already dead. We haven't received the news yet, but we are dead. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work," referring to the Jewish state. "And you see American Jewry, the spiritual dimension and the cultural ferment that you don't find here?" Shavit asks. Borg replies, "Certainly. There is no important Jewish writing in Israel. There is important Jewish writing in the United States. There is no one to talk to here. The religious community of which I was a part, I feel no sense of belonging to it. The secular community, I'm not part of that either. I have no one to talk to. I'm sitting with you, and you don't understand me either. You are stuck at a chauvinist national extremity." Unquote.
The head of the Jewish Agency?
Yes. "Accordingly, I am going to the world and to Judaism," Borg continues, "because the Jew is the first postmodernist. The Jew is the first globalist. I've already declared I am a citizen of the world. This is my hierarchy of identities. Citizen of the world, afterward Jew, and only that, after that, an Israeli. I feel a weighty responsibility for the peace of the world, and Sikorsky, in my eyes, he was talking about Sikorsky, in my eyes, a threat to world peace. That's why I went to vote against it." Ari Shavit concludes, "But it is not yet. You are an Israeli public figure who is taking part in the French presidential elections as a Frenchman. That is a far-reaching act, a pre-Zionist Jewish act, something that neither an Englishman nor a Dutchman would do." "True," Borg replies, "it is completely Jewish. I am moving forward to the Jewish tradition. Do you recommend that every Israeli take out a foreign passport? Whenever he can," Borg concludes. We'll come back to these. Remember those two. Remember Tony Kushner, and Avram Borg. My topic tonight is Jews, statehood, and power, and the notion that the Jewish people, after 2,000 years in exile, can come in and assume the reins and the responsibilities of sovereignty is not something that can be taken for granted. It cannot be taken for granted for any people, but it certainly can't be taken for granted for this people which comes with a certain rather weighty baggage, biblical baggage, historical baggage. It's not particularly, it's not a light load for individuals in this country. And here I'll start off in the truly American solipsistic sense by talking about my load, which was not essentially light either. I grew up in a place that may be familiar to some of you, a place called New Jersey, the wilds of New Jersey. And I grew up in an area that today is very religiously Jewish, but back where I grew up, I was the only Jew in my neighborhood. The entire neighborhood was completely Sicilian Italian. And from a very early age, because I was this sort of like fat, uncoordinated kid, and being Jewish on top of it, I basically got the crap beat out of me every day by my neighbors. And so I learned poignantly at an early age what not having power was about. And I didn't, my parents were sort of like moderately Zionists. My parents were to Zionism what most of my Catholic neighbors were to the Catholic Church. It was like something you supported and sent money off to once in a while, but you don't send your kids off to like join a monastery. That would be going too far. So the thought of Aliyah was completely out of the question. But I became fascinated with Israel through collecting coins, because I couldn't really go outside too much because it was too dangerous. So I sat inside and I collected a lot of coins, and I got really interested in the coins of the world, and in my inchoate sort of imagination, 9-year-old imagination. I understood that coins were a symbol of sovereignty. And if there were Italian words on an Italian coin, there's a place called Italy somewhere, and Greek words on a Greek coin, there's a Greece. And I had one distant cousin in Israel who visited us one time, and he had heard that I was a coin collector, so he dipped in his pocket and brought out these shiny Israeli lirot, as they were called back then. And I go, oh, and I was in Hebrew school, and I saw that there were Hebrew letters on these Hebrew coins, and I thought, there's the syllogism. There must be a Jewish state somewhere. And I got absolutely thrilled by this notion. And at that moment, basically 9 years old, through coin collecting, I became a Zionist. And at that point, my great desire in life was to go off and become a farmer, to work on a kibbutz. And at age 15, I actually basically ran away from home, went off to a kibbutz, and I was to farming, let's see, how should I put this? What the Bush administration is to global warming. If you ever see pictures of like the Six-Day War that destroyed Egyptian equipment strewn across the Sinai Desert, this is more or less the way I left every kibbutz I was on. A lot of destroyed. Very good farmer. So I went off to do what every failed farmer does. I went off to study history, and got into studying Arab history, Middle Eastern history. But I was pretty much set from the time I was a teenager to make Aliyah. It was an assumption of mine. And what attracted me about this country, beside the awful, was the sense of Jews taking responsibility for themselves. That this was the only place in the world, certainly in the modern Jewish era, where Jews could take responsibility for themselves as Jews. They were taking responsibility for their sewer systems, for their lamp posts, certainly for the weightier questions of defending themselves, collecting taxes, taking responsibility not only for their successes, but taking responsibility for their failures, more important. And I was deeply attracted to that sense of responsibility. And I made Aliyah, went into the army, assumed that responsibility. Like the minute you put on those boots, the minute you tie those straps, basically you are binding yourself into that responsibility, and the honorousness of that responsibility became readily apparent, because as soon as I got into the army, a war broke out. I ended up being in the war for a long time, and then when I got out of the army, I worked in government, and the guy I was working for managed to get assassinated, and tremendous responsibilities there, and then I grew up further and had kids, and they went in the army, and they ended up getting shot at, at least one of them was hit getting shot at. So you had all of this very tremendous responsibility. There's no way you could escape the responsibility. The responsibility of Jewish sovereignty was overwhelmingly and personally poignant. It was everywhere, pervasive. Now, the ability of our individuals, such as myself, or of the people, speaking more generally, to assume this responsibility, this is really what the essence of sovereignty is extremely problematic. Problematic to you personally, but also on the level of peoplehood. Going back to the earliest experiences of the Jewish people as a people, we come into being as a people with a huge debate over whether we're willing to assume the responsibilities of sovereignty. It begins with